This is TWiT.
So I think we probably should kick off with Spotify, Joe Rogan, and what's going on there. So Spotify under a little bit of heat last week. 270 physicians, epidemiologists, scientists wrote an open letter saying you gotta do something about Joe Rogan. Joe, of course, hosts the Joe Rogan Experience, probably likely the most listened to podcast in the world. He claims 11 million listeners a week. I don't know if it's that many. It's easy to claim big numbers like that. That's a lot of people. A lot of young people, especially young men, listen to Joe. On December 31st, Rogan had a guest on who claimed to have invented the mRNA vaccine in the face of all evidence to the contrary, and furthermore said it doesn't work and you're being hypnotized into using it. That stimulated the letter from the physicians and the scientists. Spotify declined to respond. They didn't do anything about Joe Rogan. They've taken others of his episodes down, but they said that did not meet their threshold for a takedown. So the response from other artists has been strong. Neil Young at first said, take my music down if you're not going to take Joe down. Joni Mitchell followed, Nils Lofgren, others. When Neil Young said, take my music down, I think Spotify's thought was, yeah, fine, old man, go ahead. Who cares? But the stock market did. The company lost $4 billion in market value. Its stock price tumbled 12%. We'll see what happens on Monday. That might not hold for very long. But the real question I have for all the three of you is let's start with you because you're editor-in-chief at ZDNet. What is Spotify's responsibility? They hired Rogan. They spent reportedly $100 million to get exclusive access to his podcast. So they're his employer, I guess. I mean, if we're just a show, if we're a show like ours, Spotify wouldn't have any more responsibility over it than anybody else would. Although I have to say Spotify, Apple, and others have pulled down other podcasts. I think Alex Jones famously is hard to find a platform for him. What is Spotify's responsibility, Jason?
Yeah, there's really two fundamental issues, and we'll start with maybe the sort of the first one. Getting back to the sort of the base principles of this is like, what's your responsibility as a platform to have a certain level of freedom of expression, right? So that are you the arbiter of taste of truth, because truth is somewhat malleable. Or because when you do that, then you open yourself up to claims of bias. So this goes back to the beginning of Twitter. Twitter sort of originally stated, we're just the platform. Whatever people put on here is up to them, and the merits of it, or the ability to publish things that not everybody likes is okay, because you have to put up with that in order to allow everyone to have a platform. Well, we see how that worked out for them, right? Eventually, they came under a lot of pressure in a number of different ways because of things that were done on their platform that then became even dangerous or destructive in some way to society. It's the same with Spotify. So they are going to be under continuing pressure. And I think there was a certain sense that if this was just Neil Young, who is a bit of, can be a bit iconoclastic, right? He is a person who likes to take stands.
Yeah. He's very vocal. Yeah.
Exactly. Very vocal. If it was just Neil Simon, I think Spotify might have said, we're still going to sort of stick to our guns on the platform angle. But once it elevated from there to others and spread, and the idea of this, well, now it's sort of a bigger problem where there's more societal backlash against this, and there's a lot more pressure. So that's the first piece, is this platform issue. The second is the fact that their strategy, their podcast strategy, has not really worked out as well as they thought.
Yeah.
That's
clear, right?
They spent
$100 million for Joe Rogan is a lot of money. And they bought Call Her Daddy for $60 million reportedly. They spent $500 million on acquisitions of Gimlet Media and Anchor FM.
Yep. They have a lot invested. And from what I can't remember exactly how much of this they have announced publicly, but the understanding is in the industry that Joe Rogan is by far their most popular podcast.
I think he ranks number one on their list. Yeah.
And so this is where it starts to get tricky from a business standpoint. It's a business that's already struggling. He's probably the biggest hit and maybe the only real hit that they've got. And so now they have also a very difficult question that's going to hit them in the pocketbook, where a strategy that's already struggling, and that they're looking at, maybe do we have to reboot this or pivot it? And now their biggest moneymaker is under a lot of heat. Yeah. And so it's a twofold question for them, and they're in a difficult spot, and we hope that they figure out a way to find a good path forward.
Broadcaster Brene Brown has said, I don't want my shows on Spotify. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, who were reportedly working on a show for Spotify and been paid a lot of money to do it, now are expressing concerns. I should mention, I did not know this, but part of the story is that Neil Young himself had polio when he was 5 years old, contracted polio 2 years before there was a polio vaccine. Spent a lot of time in the hospital relearning how to walk. People forget what a scourge polio was in the 50s. And when the Salk vaccine came out, I'm sure there were some people who refused to get it, but I don't think there were many. It was a terrifying disease, and I think that was almost universal support of the vaccination at that time. He is a vaccine supporter because of that. He also has epilepsy and type 1 diabetes, so he's very kind of aware of this. Is there a First Amendment story, Denise? Internet's attorney.
Hi. Quick answer: no. There's no First Amendment story here.
This is not the government.
This is not the government. This is a private entity making decisions, and it has to confront a couple of factors here.
Sometimes people
makes those decisions.
Sometimes people use the words First Amendment as a way of saying free speech. Mm-hmm. Two different things. We do have free speech, but he works for a company, and any company has the right to say to their employees, hey, you can't say that.
That's right. So it is a Spotify question of what sort of information or disinformation it's going to support on its platform. We've been through this on other platforms. Spotify is no different than decisions that Facebook has had to make, Twitter has had to make, as Jason has pointed out, except for the relationship that you pointed out, Leo, where they're, as you say, there's more of a partnership here between Spotify.
They're not just publishing his podcast. Yes. They own his podcast.
Right.
Which gives them a higher responsibility, I would think, right?
Not from a legal standpoint. From a legal standpoint, they just have to decide, if they can weather this storm of the adverse public opinion, other artists pulling out. I see also Joni Mitchell and Nils Lofgren have jumped in and said, we're going to pull our content. So it's kind of like, the whole close your account movement with Facebook. How much of that are they willing to, Meta, how much of that are they willing to put up with? And how much do they think they can weather of that kind of adverse, both, financial impact directly from what they're able to offer on their platform, and also the adverse public opinion? Do people really want to support the platform? The adverse stock price impact? So there's a lot there they're going to have to make some business decisions about. I hope they have a good crisis PR firm, good crisis management team on board to help them make these decisions. And I think Jason's dead on that they're going to have to act responsibly, not just to manage public opinion and their bottom line, but lingering out there in the background, even though there's no legal requirement that I can think of right now. Certainly there have been rumblings among congresspeople. The Surgeon General of the United States has made several statements about misinformation and their lack of patience for it. So I think we can...
This is somewhat more complicated because while some of us might say saying the vaccine doesn't work and don't do it is misinformation. Others say it's just an opinion. And so it's a little different in public health because yes, it's just an opinion, but if it's an opinion that is wrong from the terms of public health, then it's more than just an opinion, right?
I think the Surgeon General of the United States would say so.
Yeah.
And
it's
and
tricky.
That's what they have to get out in front of, and not be the poster child for some sort of regulatory action or congressional action that is meant to curb this kind of thing.
Well, how could Congress weigh in? I mean, doesn't the First Amendment protect Spotify just as much as it does Joe Rogan?
So, yes, you raise a good point that Congress is not going to be able to do content.
Then it gets thrown out in court immediately.
Yes, I think that Congress is less of a threat, but you're right. There are limits to the First Amendment, and if it is a public health consideration that is decided, yes, it would face a First Amendment challenge. But I think it would be, if you could demonstrably say that this is adverse to public health, that a court could very much uphold whatever was put in place. If I were Spotify, I would certainly want to get out in front of this.
Well, Daniel Ek did publish a long piece today, probably written by Crisis PR, a Crisis PR firm, in which he, said what any Crisis PR firm would say he should say. We haven't been transparent around the policies that guide our content more broadly, but we have had rules in years for place. Kind of sorry we haven't been more clear. Today we're publishing our long-standing platform rules, which apparently they had never published before. We're working, and this is, I guess, the response, and I think this is probably the right response. We're working to add a content advisory to any podcast episode that includes a discussion about COVID-19, directing listeners to our dedicated COVID-19 hub, which provides access to, he says, data-driven facts. I've always thought maybe the thing to do is just to say right at the beginning of the Joe Rogan show, hey, Joe Rogan's a comedian, and his opinions and the opinions of his guests are his own. Please consult your physician before believing them, or something.
Right.
Harry,
there was a time back last fall when people were kind of feeling this way about Fox News as well.
Right.
That there were some commentators who had gone on that network and said some things that I think prompted the Surgeon General to come out and say, hey, we need some more responsibility around the information that's being put out there. But I think you raise a really good point too, Leo, is that, here we are. This is a different format. Podcasting is not an largely scripted medium, although there's a lot of scripted podcasting out there. But when you're talking about discussion and people sitting around a table or a virtual table, as in our case here, trying to wrap their head around the issues of the day and doing their best with that, even if they're sort of fumbling and stumbling along and they don't get everything right, there's value to that too.
There's also, and I probably should have said this, in the contract language that says Spotify has exclusive distribution rights but does not own the show, which gives them a little bit of a distance from the show. Harry, what should Spotify have done? Should they put a disclaimer on there? Should they take it down? Should they ignore it and just say, hey, it's a podcast, anything goes?
I mean, my guess is that the stuff that Daniel Ek is saying today won't make anybody terribly happy. And what it reminds me of is what the YouTubes of the world were doing a year to a year and a half ago. They started out initially saying that we will put labels on stuff and direct people to health information pages. And when they did that, it really didn't make anybody terribly happy. And they ended up tightening the screws a lot more on misinformation. I think it's possible that Spotify will have to do that too. I know some people thought that Neil Young expected that Spotify might choose him over Joe Rogan, which was not going to happen. It seems a lot more.
They called his bluff right away on that one.
Right. Well, he really raised the visibility. We're having this discussion now because he did that, and because people like Joni Mitchell, who also had polio, being of the same age group as Neil Young, reacted to what he did. And it really feels a little bit like Spotify, who has this heritage in music, which is usually a bit less controversial than spoken word content, is still sort of catching up with where the rest of the internet was a lot earlier in the pandemic.
Yeah. And I think the response of the artist is interesting because it's not like Twitter or YouTube. It's a little bit like YouTube, but really the artists are what make Spotify money. And so Spotify's reluctance to censor Joe Rogan because he makes them a lot of money, they spend a lot of money for the podcast, is offset by other artists saying, well, you can't make money on my stuff in that case. And that actually is hitting Spotify where they live. I wonder, I think Neil Young probably knew his voice alone was insufficient, but probably hoped that others would follow his lead, and that, all that would be left on Spotify is Kid Rock, Ted Nugent, and and the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. I don't know. It's an interesting situation. It's just another case like Twitter, like YouTube, where these platforms are challenged, and then of course it always becomes so politicized. And I think that's interesting too. It's become about politics, not about public health, not about what's right or wrong, but just, what's politically expedient.
I guess as that more shoes will drop. I mean, it seems pretty unthinkable that this could involve any kind of breakup with Joe Rogan, but but more stuff could happen. We have no idea about the conversations going on behind the scenes at Spotify, and we might never know those.
And
Will Joe Rogan double down on this stuff? Will he pull back?
That's an interesting question. I wonder if Daniel Ek called Joe and said, hey, it would be nice if next episode you might say something like, hey, I'm just a comedian. You should probably consult a variety of sources before you decide what to do. There are people, I know people who aren't getting vaccines because of Joe Rogan.
Wow.
He's really influential.
He's very influential. He also sells vitamins. He also sells products that claim to boost your immune system. He's kind of promoting his own commercial interests in this a little bit as well, which I think is reprehensible.
I have a question I'd like to ask you all about this. Why isn't Apple having this problem? Well, obviously they don't have Joe Rogan on board, but
well,
that's
the difference, isn't it? So Spotify isn't just a directory of podcasts.
Yeah.
Apple's just a directory of podcasts. So Apple, I think, I don't know, rightly or wrongly says, well, he's not our boy.
Yeah.
But they did pull Alex Jones down. It took a long time and a lot of pressure.
And Apple was tweeting about the fact that they still have all the Neil Young you can listen to. So
that's right.
Had a little fun.
They jumped on that one. They said, oh, yeah, we're the home of Neil Young.
A lot of people have pointed out that you can listen to Steve Bannon by going to Apple Podcasts, which is, you might be able to make the case that you shouldn't be able to do that, but it's quite different given that Steve Bannon is not a content partner of Apple or their signature podcast, and they're just really pointing to it in the way that Google points to reprehensible websites.
It's part of the new world because when media was controlled by big companies, you could say, well, if the New York Times publishes an article that's bad, we can go after them. But podcasts, for the most part, are not owned by anybody. These companies would like to say, well, we're just a directory. But the minute Apple pulls down Alex Jones, suddenly it's not just a directory anymore. They're making editorial decisions. So they've kind of opened up this Pandora's box. I, for one, don't want to see any company like Apple or Spotify or Microsoft or any company have the power to say to an independent podcast, you may not exist. Google has that power for websites. You may not exist. Nobody can find you. By the way, I should also point out, Neil Young hated, at least for a long time, hated Apple because of the quality of the music. He said, never listen to iTunes. My songs sound terrible on iTunes. Maybe that's changed now that Apple does lossless as well. But
Ponyo? Wasn't that the name of the
I have a Pono player. Yeah, I have a Pono player. Yeah. Neil Young
is a wonderful idea.
Actually, the company has placed a playlist of Neil Young's music, I hear, right into the browse section, right under We Love Neil.
Oh, my goodness.
So that's just blatant commercialism. That's just blatant, that's not saying we love vaccines. I swear.